Hey everyone, welcome to Group Text. You guys know by now that I am a bona fide true crime. I don't even think the word fan is appropriate. Let's go with junkie. And today I'm thrilled to be talking with two filmmakers who have tackled a different side of the most famous Hollywood murder case in history. Melissa Moore and Jesse Daniels are both executive producers on the new docuseries, The Life and Murder of Nicole Brown Simpson, which is now streaming on Lifetime. Jesse was also the executive producer on Surviving R. Kelly, which earned not only an Emmy nomination, but won a prestigious Peabody Award. His producing partner, Melissa Moore, is an Emmy-nominated crime correspondent, an author, a podcast host, and most recently the executive producer of The Prison Confessions of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, as well as Gypsy Rose, Life After Lockup, which is also streaming on Lifetime. Melissa and Jesse, welcome to Group Text.
Thank you. This
Thank
is
you so much.
fun.
So this is so in my wheelhouse, and I have been counting the days till this because you guys might not know, but I'm literally, and my mother was too, we are true crime junkies. Like, we would stand at parties if we were bored and we would discuss between Law and Order and all the forensic files we've watched, could we pull off a crime? And now I watch forensic files and go like, how could they be so stupid? This is so obvious how it's going to, play out. As you guys know, this is in my wheelhouse, and I've been counting the days until I got to talk to you. But it is hard to believe that there are people who don't actually know what happened to Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman June 12th, 1994. But there are people who are young or weren't even born yet, like my son. So give us the cliff notes of what happened. How did Nicole and OJ meet? How long were they married? Like, cliff note it for people who don't necessarily know.
Nicole Brown, who soon became Nicole Brown Simpson, met OJ in the late 70s. She was, we believe, around 18 years old. She had been a waitress at a club called the Daisy in Beverly Hills, and certainly O.J. Simpson frequented that place, and he was, I believe, at the back end of his superstar football career, and still married, mind you, but spotted Nicole, and according to what we've heard, fell madly in love with her pretty instantly, and so Nicole was not at that point aware of his marriage to Marguerite then, but they started a date and they fell madly in love with one another, and had quite a long marriage that included two children, and they divorced in the early 90s, but still would see each other. They still had custody that they shared. And then, I mean, this is Cliff Notes, of course. In 94, as you mentioned, she gets murdered right outside of her Bundy townhouse, along with a friend of hers, Ron. So that, of course, ignited what we now call as the trial of the century in the late 90s, and one of the most fascinating stories of our time.
God, I just sit here thinking, I'm like, I remember watching the Bronco chase because we lived in Beverly Hills. So I knew exactly where that car was going. I knew exactly, for those of us who lived here, we knew the route. Yeah. Everyone really does know so much about it. I mean, no other case garnered that kind of media attention right off the bat, from the night of the murders to the Bronco chase to the trial to the verdict. Why were we all so fascinated, and why are we still fascinated?
That's a good question. For me, what kept my curiosity about the case was that I always wanted to know the backstory of Nicole and the genesis, the love story between Nicole and OJ. How did this start? Because we know how it ended, but how did it start? And so I let that curiosity be my guide as we started this journey with the documentary. And also, the second question that always haunted me is why that night? Out of all the nights, we now, through the trial, we heard about the abuse, but why that night?
Yeah, I to kind of piggyback on that. It felt like we knew that there's been all this amazing reporting and documentaries on this story. Like the world knows this story better than almost any other crime story, right? And so we knew we had that challenge that we were facing of like, what is our story here and why are we doing this? And so when Melissa first started this journey, I mean, I'll let you talk about it, Melissa, of course, about 10 years ago. And then I jumped in about a year and a half ago and met the Brown sisters. We realized that this story, yes, this story has been told in so many different vantage points, so many different points of view. But the one story that had never been told, the one story we still didn't know up until now, is Nicole's.
That's what I was about to say is it's been explored every way, but from Nicole's point of view.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have so many questions and I'm trying to stay kind of in order so it all makes sense. What I found so interesting was the level of naivete in Nicole. And, I like to think she didn't know he was married. I like to think that she really didn't know who he was. I'd question why when he was so aggressive, their first date, that her pants had been ripped. What happened? Why was she like, yeah, but I'm really into this guy? I mean, that's what I find so fascinating is really the genesis of this. And you look at her later and you're like, oh, she gets it. She's sophisticated. Look at her friends. And it's hard for me to wrap my head around that she was literally, this pretty girl out of a Beach Boys song.
I felt like she really was that person. She came from a bubble. She grew up in a gated and guarded community. I think that really bothered me with the idea that she needed OJ's money. She came from money. And so I feel like that was a rumor that started during the trial. Honestly, there's so many myths out there and so many rumors that to sort out the fact from the fiction was a big part of this as well, is just showing the start of Nicole's story she came from this beautiful beach community and she lived what I think Judy Monto said it best, in a resort. So, and that's where she got this idea of this perfect world and a perfect romance is from viewing it from her parents. She grew up in this beautiful home with a beachside community, and she grew up very privileged with a loving mother and a loving father. And it was like the Cleavers. It was everything that you could dream of to be raised in a family.
And, again, what you only know what you know.
Right.
So
right.
why did she expect anything different?
Exactly. So she moves to LA and I believe it's only weeks into her moving to LA where she meets OJ Simpson, who is this massive celebrity, charismatic, good looking. Everybody wants to be around him and talk to him. And she's 18 years old. So it's not within that kind of context that we really try to lay out. It's not hard to believe why someone like Nicole, who even came from such a great household and home, could fall in love with somebody like him at that time.
Well, it's glamorous.
It is.
It's glamorous. The common denominator I found in a lot of your interviews, especially with Nicole's family and other close friends, was when things went south, that she resisted leaving. She knew what happened to Marguerite, I assume. You have Marguerite's sister, who's very measured in her answers when asked about the relationship with Marguerite and OJ. You can read between the lines. You hear from the photographer from across the street, like this was not a one-off. This was his pattern. And Nicole experienced the pattern. Why did she keep going back? And I know that's a big question about domestic violence, but it felt to me like she actually saw him do these things. She threw Denise into a wall. It's puzzling because it's like one thing to do it to me, don't you touch my family.
Right. So being a survivor of domestic violence myself, I watched my mom be beaten. And then what I think is hard to unwrap and explain is that while you see the lowest of the lows, or you experience the lowest of the lows, people don't really see the highs of the highs. So after the abuse, that is where the love bombing, we now have language now, but in the 90s, we didn't have language to talk about. I mean, I think they called it battered women syndrome back in the 90s. And there wasn't terms like narcissistic abuse. There wasn't gaslighting. There wasn't even narcissism wasn't even a conversation like what we have today. But now we know what love bombing is. And that is what OJ was like, quite frankly, a genius at. After abuse, there comes the Porsche, there comes the Cartier, there comes the this will never happen again. And then in her lockbox, we see letter after letter affirming like, this will never happen again. I'm so sorry. I lost, my sense of judgment. Those weren't his verbatim words, but in sense, the context of what he's trying to say to her. So I think there's also there's another term that we now know, which is called trauma bonding. And you get used to the devil, the cycle. And so you know that this low point ends at some point and the high happens again. And so you start to just get used to this pattern and know that it's just a temporary thing. And you always hope it'll never happen again. So, I mean, that's just to summarize a very complex, situation.
It's also possible that even though Nicole had this support system, this family and friends, that in the 80s, late 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, people didn't know how to deal with domestic violence, how to talk about it. It was something that felt like you dealt with just in the household, in home, privately. Police officers didn't even know how to respond to it at the time. So one could easily imagine Nicole didn't it felt like she was on an island during those darkest moments. And then later on, of course, she had kids with him. So that even adds another more complicated layer to how to deal with this. It's not just as easy as just walking out the door. And certainly we know now, again, so much more than we knew then, that it takes on average 7 attempts for a victim to leave their abuser. So yeah, it's a big question, of course, that we try to answer throughout the doc.
You bring up the lockbox. How did you come to that? Because there were photos, the diaries that you show things in her handwriting. Who had those? It's like the who, what, when, where, why. Who had them? When did they open them? Why are they just sharing this now? That's the most fascinating thing to me is first of all, you're telling it from Nicole's point of view rather than one of the men's point of view, which is a whole new way to look at this story, but then to actually have her words.
Right. Right. So after she was found murdered, shortly afterwards, they were doing investigations. They obviously searched her home. And then in the documentary, we show the detective that came to discover the lockbox that she kept at her local bank. And in that lockbox, the contents were her diaries that she previously was told by her attorney many years ago to keep, a log of abuse. So she did document as over 60 incidents of domestic violence that are logged into these diaries. She also kept the photographs from the New Year's Eve incident where she had been beaten by OJ and as documentation. And then she had 3 letters were in that lockbox as well of OJ apologizing and trying to make amends and to get her back into her life. And so to me, what was haunting, this was her words from the grave. This is her story, and that it was never used in the court of law, never used in the trial. And that to me is astonishing that she couldn't even defend herself after death.
Her will was in that lockbox too, on top of everything else.
Yes, her will that she made just days prior to her murder.
Why were these not part of the trial? I mean, goes to character.
Right. Hearsay. So now the laws have changed where diary entries can be entered into the court of law, but at that time in the 90s, they were not allowed.
So I'm assuming her family had possession of all these things.
Most of these were in the court records as evidence that was not admissible into court. And so to us as filmmakers, we wanted to bring Nicole's voice, her literal voice, and her own voice in her writing to this documentary.
Why didn't the family end up have possession of those after trial?
Well, there was Dita and Lou have since passed away. And so it was a little confusing on where the hard copies, the original diaries have gone. We can speculate where they ended up, but we know that it was eventually given back to Lou and Dita. But from that point when they passed, we don't know where they went exactly.
So who said to you, because I'm assuming it was family, said to you, these pages exist?
I knew they existed from an old National Enquirer.
Hey, research is research. And at that time, it's like TMZ now. National Enquirer was usually pretty accurate. I mean, TMZ, if it's on TMZ, it's 99% accurate.
Right. So
The Star, questionable. National Enquirer, gold standard.
So what I did is I went on eBay and I ordered a whole bundle of old National Enquirers, and then I found one that said Nicole's Diaries. I'm like, what? These exist?
You know what? I have it right here, actually.
There you go.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Nice. You need to put it in like one of those plastic, hermetically sealed, acid-free paper.
That's right.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, it was, that was kind of because for this documentary, we knew we were setting out to tell a completely new story. We had to really dig deep. We had a great research team that looked at every single article out there, because some of the best information came from one small article, some local publication. And so that's it. That was a big part of our process and our journey, and is trying to collect all this evidence that really helped tell us who Nicole was and give her a voice in this story.
What's interesting is, in this weird way, OJ ended up getting a free pass, not just from the public and those closest to him, but yet nobody you interviewed, even people close to him, ever stood up and said, you got it all wrong. OJ wasn't like that. He was completely misunderstood. That to me was, the only person who really ever defended him, but did so with silence, was Marguerite. I mean, you would think there would be one person out there saying, hey, time out. Guys, this was a bad moment, a bad incident. We don't know who did it, why, but let's just roll back and say this was not the constant narrative, because it is portrayed in the public that it was constant, not over such a long period of time.
Well, to partially answer that, one thing that I noticed in observation of telling this story is that there was a sense of removal that the people closest to OJ wanted to have. And that is for their own privacy. And I think it was due to the media circus that existed at the time. Is like anybody that stepped forward was, you stepped on a podium and said it's free game, and the media could unravel anything that you don't want shared to the world. So you were putting a walking target on yourself if you came forward in defense, or maybe even associating yourself with Simpson. So that's my observation of why I think that didn't happen.
We ended up interviewing 50 people for this documentary. It was a ambitious endeavor. I think we certainly talked to people that we knew supported OJ and still defend him. But then it's a matter of them wanting to interview and talk about it, as Melissa said. So those people are out there. It's just putting themselves out, in front of a camera is a challenge.
One of the things that really I didn't expect to be moved by watching it was Al Cowling's deposition.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
He's so genuinely upset and so genuinely, he's not even conflicted. He's clearly a man in shock. Yet he was never portrayed that way. He was always thought of as like one of the guys that covered for him or this or that. And I thought that was really interesting, that nobody ever really talked to Al Cowlings after 10 years later, however long later, and say, you're safe to talk about this now. What went on in the Bronco?
One thing that I observed, Melissa, from particularly the male interview subjects that we had, is that they had an underlying tremendous amount of guilt for not being able to protect Nicole. And so I can only assume that AC carries a guilt for not being able to protect Nicole. I mean, Ron Hardy in the interview, he said he feels a tremendous amount of guilt for not being able to protect her. He loved her and he never was able to protect her. Dave LeBon said the same thing. It was a sentiment that was shared by most of the men, if not maybe all of the men, that they had a sense of guilt that they live with today over that. So I'm going to assume that AC probably carries that as well.
Who failed Nicole the most?
That's a good question.
I think we did. To be honest, I think that we couldn't have this kind of conversation, we the public. We were so interested in the spectacle of the trial, of the whodunit in the murder, the way the image that Nicole's image was kind of the cover of these magazines, and the kind of person she was portrayed as at that time. I think the public failed to look at the details of her story, and just wanted to participate in this big spectacle. And so in a way, the public, we kind of failed her probably the most.
What I'm just thinking just now is, and I didn't really think of it till just this moment, her legacy, Nicole's legacy, has really become, I want to say, a lesson, but she really opened the door to conversations about domestic violence and started to help make a societal change in the way it's perceived and all this. Does her family realize yet that her legacy is so important on such a larger level? Or do you think that's still too big of an umbrella to see? It just dawned on me because that's really when we started talking a lot about domestic violence, and or the movie The Burning Bed and battered women's syndrome. These conversations all came out of this public horror. And I think hopefully for her kids, years from now, it'll not feel like her death was a waste. Do you think her family has started to perceive that? Do you think that's why they wanted to participate in telling her story? Or did I just think of something completely randomly out of the top of my mind?
That's a great question. In episode 4, I feel like we answer that in the sense
Which
that
I wasn't allowed to see yet, says bitter Betty.
So episode 4, we dive into the call from Biden's office with the Violence Against Women Act, and they bring Denise Brown into the fold to help move that forward. And then Denise becomes this advocate for domestic violence and goes around the world, frankly, speaking about domestic violence. I think that for sure Denise understands that. I would say Dominique and Tanya do as well. Denise was always, as you see in episode 1, it's very clear that Denise has a special bond with Nicole. She's the oldest sister, she's the protector. And then after Nicole's murder, she becomes this protector of all women and wanting to save women from this horrible epidemic of domestic violence, partner violence. And I think that was her way of coping too with the grief of her sister's loss.
What was the thing that you guys found that you looked at each other and went, holy shit, I can't believe we just found this, or that this person just said this in an interview? We've all been in those situations where someone does or says something and you're like, you're trying to be like, and you're like, yes. What was that moment for you?
I think we each had one. Jesse, you could go first on what you
Sure.
think.
I mean, there were so many different moments. Let's just say that left us in shock, in awe. The As we discussed earlier, the discovery of the safe deposit box and the actual contents in it, which really opens up the question of how much did Nicole know? Did she know at some point she would be murdered? That's an area that constantly surprised us once we started to unpack that. There was a particular interview that left us all in shock, with Deanne, who was one of Nicole's best friends, who, without giving too many details, really talks about a private conversation she has with Nicole, where Nicole confides in her about how OJ begins to use her greatest fear against her behind closed doors. And that fear would end up being what happens later in death, her cause of death. So the way that Deanne puts it, and talks about this private conversation, it left me in complete shock.
She was a fantastic interview.
Yeah.
Deanne
Yeah.
was one of those people you interview and you talk to, and there's certain people out there that you meet that remember every detail of their own life from like when they were a baby through adulthood, and they're so good at recalling that. And Deanne's one of those special people.
Then I love how you tee it up with her ex-husband, who's like, yeah, I grew up with Nicole. I don't remember anything. Talk to my ex-wife.
I kind of had to really believe, because the way that the details that Deanne goes into are just so phenomenal. This is a story that happened over 30 years ago. And so to have someone like Deanne that really can recall every single moment, the color of the shirt someone's wearing, is just really, we're lucky to have her.
I assume you shot all of this before OJ's death in April. Did that change anything for you as filmmakers? Did it make you put anything in, take anything out, make you maybe not feel handcuffed to one of the ways you were looking at something?
For me, I'll say no. The North Star was always Nicole's story. So it would be totally against it to end with OJ's passing. So it always turned back to Nicole. And this happened, his passing happened so far past our filming. It didn't impact any way in that form in the film itself. You don't see anything changed, nothing was shifted. And then Jesse, I'll let you share anything else that you think is pertinent to it.
No, not a thing changed. We already knew we had something very special and very different. We were all completely shocked to hear of his passing. We were already very deep in the edit of this process. And so we kept our sights on telling Nicole's story. So essentially nothing changed other than certainly a tidal wave of attention, on the story that came after his death.
4 kids total, 2 stepkids, 2 of her kids. Where are they all now? How are they doing? Because this is a not a great legacy.
Yeah, I think that's what I feel the saddest about, is that even with OJ's passing, it's a very sad story. It's a story that I wish didn't happen for these kids. They're victims in this more than anybody. They now are left without any parents, whether we liked OJ as a parent or not. They lost their mother in the most horrific way, and now their father's gone and they have to grieve over that. So I would say I'm just sad in general for the kids that their family endured this type of pain.
And where are they now? What are they doing? Are they having somewhat normal lives? Are they all still close? Do you know any of that?
Yeah, they're all doing well. They have their own families. They're successful. They're private, and we kept to honor that. Whatever you, I think that's one thing. I can feel like I could speak for Jesse too in this manner is that we always wanted to work with people with consent. Like because so much was exploited and voyeuristic in the 30 years ago, we didn't want to re-traumatize anybody. This was every step along the way. Everybody who participated, it was consensual. They wanted to come, they wanted to share their stories. We didn't take anything from anybody. And so I feel like that was an important aspect of this documentary. And Jesse, you could expand upon that.
No, absolutely. We go deep into Nicole as a mother, but it's always through the frame, and in turn we talk about the kids growing up, but it's through the point of view of Nicole as a mother to them and OJ as a father to them. Certainly a very interesting area, both when Nicole was alive and then what happens immediately after her death. How the Brown family rallies around the kids during the trial and builds this kind of protective bubble around them so that they could have as normal of a life and upbringing as possible when they're just kids. That's a very emotional moment that we go into in the documentary.
This is so amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time. The Life and Murder of Nicole Brown Simpson will be streaming on Lifetime. I got to tell you, it's a must-see, and I'm waiting for the next couple episodes. Jesse Daniels, Melissa Moore, thank you.
Thank you.